that the precarious work is not confined to the low-wage workers. It fundamentally affects all workers. For lowering the standards for some workers has repercussions in all sectors. The increase in the low-wage sector and the shrinking of the middle class serve as reminders of what can happen to you or to all of us, especially for people in the middle class and in the lower middle class. It keeps up a high level of self-discipline, of compliance with anything, just to keep things going, to stay where you are, to stay afloat. That's why some scholars have not only talked about neoliberalism, but about disciplinary neoliberalism, or as our comrades from Syriza in Greece call it, austeritarianism, which is the combination of the terms austerity and authoritarian.
Now, one of the big problems with sort of talking about precarity and all of this is that we don't really all mean the same things by these words. So what they mean by contingent workers, they mean temps who come from temp agencies, on-call workers, independent contractors, freelancers like me, people who are self-employed, and people who work part-time. This study was actually counting to the change in jobs between 2006 and 2010, which of course is 5 years ago now, was also sort of still at the peak of the lovely recession that supposedly ended. And so we're not exactly sure what those numbers will look like now, but there is the one thing that we can say about that is that the growth has mostly been in part-time work. Whether or not that is voluntary or involuntary part-time work, this study didn't tell us. There have been other studies that say that it's been mostly involuntary part-time, as in people who cannot get enough working hours, which is a topic that I will return to in a little bit about some of these worker organizing campaigns. These were conditions that up until fairly recently were mostly conditions that women worked under and people of color worked under, right? The temp industry, there's a fantastic book you can read all about called The Temp Economy by Erin Hatton, who's a sociologist. The temp industry started out providing Kelly girls, actually the name of the company, which is still around, it's now called Kelly Services, who were women who didn't need full-time work because they had husbands or fathers who would do that and they just needed a little bit of extra money. They didn't need benefits, they didn't need any sort of security because they would probably get bored anyway because girls don't need real jobs, right? And these conditions that this industry started out because they could get away with it because this is what mostly people thought of women's work, are now conditions for people who are working in Nissan car factories in Mississippi and Tennessee. These, the sort of quintessential American good manufacturing job is now being done by temps for $10 an hour. So these conditions spread sort of whenever we allow there to be an excluded class of workers, farm workers and domestic workers written out of New Deal era labor protections, etc. Those conditions end up affecting us all in one way or another. The big thing right now in this country, of course, that most of you have heard of, I'm sure, is the Fight for 15, which started out with worker organizing in the fast food industry, right here in the city. Thank you, New York. And has really spread, has incorporated different kinds of workers. The last big strike, one of the big selling points for the big day of action was that adjuncts were taking part, home care and child care workers were taking part. And this has really become essentially a political campaign to raise the minimum wage. It's also still a pressure campaign in the workplace for better conditions. The demand is still $15 an hour in a union. There is still, as far as I can tell, no plan for how to actually get to the union, other than a few examples. But what's happening instead is that we're seeing the politics of the minimum wage in this country change. We're seeing presidential candidates, our dear friend Bernie Sanders, call for $15 an hour. Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour. Most of those are phased in over several years. But what's happened is that worker organizing is affecting politics in a way that, I read almost daily.
But I guess to kind of summarize the figures, 1 in 4 Korean workers is actually a low-wage worker. About half of Korea's workforce is irregular. And so, for example, this is a really important distinction. In the US, I would say I'm a freelancer. And in Korea, I would just say I'm an irregular worker. And it's a very important distinction because in Korea, the labor movement is really fighting all irregularization. It's not a battle just at the workplace to gain improved wages and so on. It's always a battle to actually become a regular worker. So I'll just explain really quickly what that means in a second. And 70% of women in the workforce are precarious workers. So there are very many women-dominated fields. And about 11 to 12% of the population doesn't even receive not the population, but the workforce doesn't even receive the minimum wage. So the kind of wage struggles in Korea are very dramatic, especially when you think about how wealthy the nation's corporations are. Family owned and very complex. They're very tied to the state, to prosecutors, to the courts, to everything. And they actually expanded since the financial crisis to take over industries that low-wage workers often worked in, like bakeries and cram schools, like to study. And so when you look at these corporations, it's really hard to say that irregular workers are only in the small industries. They actually are spread across every major corporation. I'm just going to briefly mention two campaigns. The largest public sector of precarious workers, or the largest sector of precarious workers in the public sector are part-time education support workers. They are mostly women. They're the cafeteria workers, the admin, the teaching aides, and they have been really organized. They're 43% of the education workforce. So a lot of people laud and think about Korea as a very educational focused paradise, but it is really powered by a regular workforce. And they really have organized successfully in many, many school districts and are winning wages and collective agreements. And have won various worker benefits in something even as basic as a hot meal, because a cafeteria worker wasn't even entitled to a meal that they were cooking in. Youth are a new kind of rising sector of the labor movement. They don't really join the mainstream movement. They're very much concentrated in fast food. So they come out and they do these very fun, costumed protests, and they are forming like a broad youth movement. So they have like something called a youth, what's it called, like a youth workers union, young workers union or something like that. And it's not really a union, but it's actually like supposed to be for all youth in Korea. So that's something that is kind of the new face of the labor movement, which is not simply by industry, but it is kind of by demographic.
We call it in Germany just precarious work, and the other side of precarious work is the normal employment relationship, and it has been between 18 and 19% of employees have been covered by this normal employment relationship in the 60s and 70s. So precarious employment have been very marginal, and normal employment means permanent full-time jobs, dismissal protection, and some kind of a decent wage. I think it's the basic story even for the US or even South Korea: decentralization of collective bargaining, the recommodification of labor through laws, and mostly the flexibilization of the labor market, the privatization of public companies like the telecom or the railways, which is not really privatized but works like a privatized company, and mainly employment protection was curtailed. The German big trade unions tried to secure jobs for their core workforce, and on the other hand gave the other workers mainly free and didn't cover their up. So there was some kind of a corporate integration, social partnership on a very sectoral and shop floor social pact. This means BMW, one of the biggest factories, they have 60% of a core workforce and 40% or 30% of temp workers. And the core workforce is very healthy, they earn a lot of money, and they are very well protected. And the temp workers in these companies, they are working side by side with the other workers, but earn only half of the money. So the outcome of this strategy was there was no conflict, but they secured the core workforce and precarious work was rising. The IG Metall had another strategy. They tried to recruit the temp workers, the rising part of the temp workers, and they integrated them in the collective agreements, which was a fight. This was a battle for them, but they paid the price. Because the temp workers have been integrated in the collective agreements, there was some kind of acceptance that there are two classes of workers, the inside workers and the outside workers, even in this collective agreement. So the IG Metall managed to secure all the workers a little bit, but now we have real difficulties of solidarity in the big companies. The more interesting thing are the Verdi campaigns, the big service sector union. It's they have nearly 2 million members compared at the IG Metall, and they are on a lot of social conflicts in recent days. But these social conflicts are always very selective, short-term, not like a real big campaign. We haven't a campaign like the 15M campaign in the States, which is coming up from below in different states. Verdi managed to organize some security officers, is on strike in some Amazon factories for nearly 1 year now, but it's a very small part of the workforce, and made some campaigns for airport workers, but still the big unions have no general campaigns to organize low-wage workers. They campaigned successfully in Germany for minimum wage, but this wasn't combined with organizing minimum wage workers. It was just a public campaign to put pressure on politics and the parties, and they succeeded at least, but it was without organizing workers. The interesting point might be right now that Germany was one of the biggest low-strike countries in Europe. And this has a lot to do with the system of industrial relations, which is very peace-orientated. We have now individual right of strike action. The trade unions, as I said, have an orientation of social partnership, and the system of collective bargaining on a very sectoral level is always peacekeeping too. But right now, we have this kind of new class struggle about social recognition in some sectors, in the kindergartens, by the train drivers, in the postal sector, and it's getting some kind of dynamic. And what was for me the most interesting voice in this dynamic is Wolfgang Streeck. I don't know if you heard about him. Wolfgang Streeck was the intellectual champion of social partnership and corporatism in Germany for the last 40 years. And last year, he wrote a quite Marxist book about Germany and Europe, where he complained about the euro and the new inequalities. And he always tried to confine social conflict in German industrial relations. And now he's a voice of more social conflict, and what we expect in the next years is rise or persistence of more strikes in different levels, and I hope we have some kind of social conflict in low-wage workers as well. Thank you.